Sure. I'm Andy Einhorn, and I am the orchestrator for She Loves Me.
Awesome. Let's jump right in. You have a little bit of a history with Longworth Theater. What was your first interaction or introduction to Longworth?
Actually, I believe it was last year, Audra McDonald and I did the gala. I think it was 2023. We did the gala for you all. But Jacob Padron and I actually go way, way back to 2010. And we had actually first worked on a production of She Loves Me at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. So our history with both the show, but our friendship goes quite back sometime.
That's amazing. It was that show.
Yes.
I did not know that. So that is so cool. Longworth Theater is not your average theater, right?
Yes.
We have no building anymore. We're experimenting, we're doing new things. What made you say yes given all of that?
I love the mission of the theater, and I think one of the things that as theater perseveres, and especially coming out of the pandemic, I think we're constantly needing to reevaluate what theater means and how we're creating art, because I think the tried and true way worked for a certain amount of time, and I think it still works in many capacities. But I think when we look at how arts need to be provided to communities, sometimes we need to think outside the box. We actually need to be thinking, how do we expand and how do we find new outreach? If you look at media in general, media is coming in so many forms at this point. We have it on our phones, we have it on our computers, we have it on our tablets, we also have it on TV. And one of the things that I was incredibly cognizant of during the pandemic was how much content was coming at us in almost an overstimulating manner. And I think part of the challenge of live theater at this point is, how do we capture that for an audience, and how do we keep reinvigorating audiences to want to come to live performance? So I love the mission of Longworth Theater, and I love that you all actually don't have a home right now, because I actually think that's to its benefit, because it means that you're finding locations that's creating and generating audience interest in wanting to participate in the experience, because it means that if I go to this location or that location, I'm invested in the piece and what the mission of the theater is doing. So for me, this was actually a no-brainer whatsoever. And I also love Jacob, and I love She Loves Me.
That is awesome. And She Love Me is beloved by so many. Um, why do you love She Loves Me?
That's a great question. As somebody who loves old musicals and has made a career out of doing old musicals, one of the things that I love the most is sort of for better or for worse, the anatomy, or sort of the creation of why musicals were put together in a very specific way. So I love sort of the math and the science behind how music and dialogue work together. So for instance, how the book works with the music and the lyrics. And when I was first introduced to She Loves Me when I was a teenager, I remember being captivated by the story, but also the score. And in many ways, to me, I think it's actually the perfect musical. I think that the way it was written, and from what I know about how it was written, the way that Joe Mastroff, who wrote the book, as well as Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick, who wrote the score, the way that they collaborated together made it a perfect musical, because they were actually listening to one another. They were allowing the book to do what the book needed to do, and allowing the score what the score needed to do. So when the two came together, you were really getting the perfect synthesis of character and music. And that's evident in the evolution of, when an audience comes to see this story, as it unfolds, you start to learn about the characters through song, but the songs are also pushing the plot forward. So in that way, it's kind of the perfect paradigm of a musical. And I often espouse that She Loves Me is the perfect musical. It's a jewel box musical. And given who these collaborators were, they went on to write Fiddler on the Roof, and they were writing at a time coming out of the golden age of musical theater. Everybody was at their top of the game. So I just love this musical because I think the songs really speak to people's hearts. And I think there's something for everybody who comes to see it, whether or not you relate to Arpad, whether you relate to Amalia, whether you relate to Marachek, I think there's something for everybody in this show to find. Also, the story is an age-old great story. This is an adaptation of a play, which then was turned into a movie, which is then turned into a musical, and then was reinvented for the movie You Got Mail. So I think it's one of those, it's a classic story, and I think people love it. And I think I have always wished this show actually had much more prominence. And early in my career, I had a chance to work with the great Barbara Cook, who played the original Amalia in 1963. And I asked her why she thought this show never sort of became a wow blockbuster show. And her answer was very interesting to me because it was coming at a time where sort of there was a new wave of technology on Broadway, and this was a very character-driven show. And this was a show that really spoke to people in a very intimate manner. And in some ways, she felt that because of that, it was never going to really receive its due because it didn't have the bombast of other musicals. But I think for those of us who are sort of musical theater purists, there's something to be found in this story. And I always feel that audiences end up loving this show. And I think it's one of those things that once you get in the door, you just fall madly in love with it and you end up being captivated by the story.
That is so true. Sorry.
Ah,
So
That
true.
is so true.
it
Because I
is.
got to see, again, I got to experience this show firsthand.
Yeah.
I'm video producer with the team. And I got to experience it for the first time, but everyone has had a chance to just taste test here and there.
Yeah.
And I got to taste, I'm like, holy shit, this is really, really good.
And it's beautiful. And I think the thing that has always surprised me about it is that reaction, that people come to it with not ambivalence, but just it's one of those where it's an unknown. For many years when I was in high school, I desperately was trying to convince my high school to do the show, and they just never would commit to doing it. And I always thought this is such a mistake because it not only are the songs incredible to sing, the music is great, but the story is funny. And it's so timely, and if you do it around the holidays, people love it because it puts you exactly in the right mood. I remember, I love the scene in You Got Mail when they're up at the cafe, oh God, is it Cafe Lala, which is up at 83rd. And it's just so Christmassy, and you just feel so full of life and joy. And I think that's actually what the show is. And I think one of the things that I love that Jacob has done with the show is really set it against the backdrop of the time that it was written. And I think musicals are so interesting when we can look at the social backdrop of when they were written. For instance, I'm working on Gypsy right now, which is coming out of the Depression and how that affects the characters and their needs and their wants. I'm working on a production of Sound of Music. That show is set also at the time of World War II coming, and it's not just about a woman who sings with 7 children. It's actually a story about a family that has to find survival and escape something. And I think a lot of these characters in She Loves Me, the interesting thing is their world inside the perfumery is safe to them. When you go outside, that's where the danger is. So when Amalia goes into the Cafe Imperial to wait for Dear Friend, that's a very scary moment for her because what if he doesn't show up? I don't want to give away the plot, but what if he's not the person that he wants her to be? There's a danger in there, and there's actual stakes in there, and I think that's the part that's so relatable to everybody. Sorry, I can wax poetically about the show.
Yeah, so you, our very own Jacob, is directing this play. What was your approach, the two of you, or how did you land on the vision that you guys would support?
When Jacob called me about this, he said, how about doing a version where we strip this down to the emotional core? And I said, I love that because I think that's what the show is. And I think that's what the show presents itself as. And there have been productions that sometimes go a little bit bigger and go for the showbiz or go for the sort of the bells and whistles or the decorations on the wall. But when we were discussing this, I said, every character bears themselves in a very vulnerable and emotional way with the audience. And that's what is the essence of the show. And that's what we need to capture. So part of the job of even paring down the size of the cast and then even more paring down the size of the orchestration, allows an audience to come in and hear it and really be able to listen. I think sometimes when we're overstimulated by too much noise or too much scenery or overdressing something, we're not able to actually just focus. And I think one of the challenges facing all of us right now in life is how we find focus. And what are those moments when you can actually just stay quiet and stay calm? And it's so interesting because I find noise to be loud. Even in the room that we're in right now, if you listen, there is a din in this room. When you're in an empty theater, there is still noise. So when are the moments where you can find that quiet? And so one of the things that we were really looking for in this version was to find the quiet. The other thing was, how do these songs function? What are the circumstances they come out of? And I kept saying to Jacob, are you okay if I try different ins on the songs? You know, like how we're getting in. A song doesn't necessarily always need to come right out of tempo, because if you're actually paring this down and having us listen to the character, there's an appropriate sort of, as I'd like to use the image of a plane taking off on a runway. A plane doesn't sort of just go from here up to here. There's an actual ascent. And I think part of what we were going after here is how you create a vocabulary for an audience to understand that transition from dialogue into song, and how the characters can then best be served by doing that, and then matching that in the orchestration so that you really sonically are aware that the thing starts, that some songs start big, sometimes songs start a little more pared down, and then if you notice, a few more instruments will start to come in, and then if the song's requiring a big end, we'll go for a big end, but perhaps actually not every song needs that, because maybe the character is a bit more wistful at the end, and so we need to taper off.
That's so funny, because I hear a lot of the comments, whether they be from talkbacks
Mhm.
or like our social emails, and a lot of the comments are like the music is so seamless.
Ah,
Like,
good.
you don't feel like, oh, they're gonna stop for a song. It's just like, it's just there. Like this is where it belongs.
I love
so we
that.
had a lot of those.
That makes me very
Yes.
happy, because
Yeah.
that's the challenge of taking also, you know, She Loves Me was originally scored for probably 35 players in the original production. And obviously it sounds fantastic, and you hear all the Hungarian influence and the Broadway sound, and that's wonderful. But again, when you're putting it into a small space, I think sometimes what is really required of us as artists who are creating that for an audience, especially audiences who don't really know the show, is asking you to actually use music as another form of lighting. And what I mean by that is spotlighting and creating shades in there. And I often think of orchestration as yet another element of that. It's just lighting, but for the ears, so that the ears really know what you're supposed to be listening to, and giving space for the singer, as well as creating a bed of support for that singer.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that, again, one of my favorite elements about Rent is exactly that.
Yes.
It's off tempo pacing, and the songs just come in because they make sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it makes you like them.
Yes.
Rather than the stereotype that people have in musicals, like, okay, a song's about to start, I'm gonna go, get something.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
it's in a combo. Yeah.
Yes.
So like piggybacking off that, right? This is a classic show. We've stripped it down some. Where do you see like the line of respecting a classic versus like having the courage to change some things or innovate? Where does that line move for you?
That's a great question. I've made a career now out of doing big revivals of musicals. And one of the things that I think is important when re-examining a piece is trying to understand what the collaborators, or how the collaborators might approach the work if they were writing it today, and with a knowledge of where today's audiences are and what audiences are expecting. And I think obviously my goal is to never change a single harmony, never change a single melody. I actually think the best approach to it is always looking at how a performer is creating a performance and being able to taper what is around them. If you're working on a new musical today, oftentimes that's being shaped on the performers in the room. The process of writing new musicals today is obviously very different than how it was written years ago. Somebody recently told me that Gypsy was written in 3 months, which is one of the most staggering facts I've ever heard, because it's a brilliant piece of theater and it's hard to imagine that somebody could write that so quickly. But they were geniuses. And so I think when looking at a work, my goal is always to, in some ways, I think some of these shows are a bit dusty, and I mean dusty in the sense that they've been preserved as one thing. And I think part of our job is to re-examine and question, but pay honor to what is there and to respect that. And I think in doing so, it's really getting inside the material and sometimes trying to understand, okay, why was that choice made in 1963? Does that choice still work in 2024? If not, what's the version that would work in 2024 that I believe these people would want us to uphold, that respects the material without trampling on it or desecrating it in some way? But I think it's important for us to be able to look at it and really try to get inside the mindset, because as revivals continue to happen, especially big musicals on Broadway, I think you're seeing re-examination through different eyes. Sometimes I believe it to be successful, sometimes not as successful. But my intent is always to try to honor what's there and not say, oh, I can do better than that. Because if I can't do better than that, then there is no reason to change that. And that's my number one principle is, are we doing better than what was there?
Speaking of revival, we gotta talk a little bit about Gypsy. So you are on board this Gypsy train, which is amazing, starring Audra, who we love.
Yes.
Friend of our theater. Can you just talk a little bit about that process or your decisions in that show?
Sure.
What's it been like? Just share.
Sure. We've been talking about doing Gypsy for about 5-6 years at this point, and thankfully to our great producers Tom Curtahy and Mara Isaacs, and the great George C. Wolfe, who's directing, we were able to wrangle everybody in the same room, which sometimes can be a bit tricky. And we had the blessing of all the estates, Arthur Lawrence, Julie Stein, Sondheim, Jerome Robbins. Everybody's been incredible, and also given us another chance to examine a classic. And what I'm very excited about what we've done is we've looked at a classic through the eyes of race. And in this production, race has played a big part. But again, we have not changed a single word. We have not changed a single lyric. And I think that speaks to the power of the show, that it can be heard through those voices. And I think one of the things, that, again, that's important in revivals is that all voices should be heard and must be heard. And I think it's important for audiences to listen to stories like that through a different voice, and to be able to examine, what does that mean when a character says something and I'm hearing it through somebody who has not played this role before. And I think it's an incredible, incredible feat for our team, but I also think it is a wonderful invitation to audiences to come and hear that today, because I think it's essential. Because whether or not the original Gypsy and Rose were white, there is a parallel story through a Black family. I guarantee you that was there. So to be able to put a spotlight on that is essential for our time right now. And I think it makes the show incredibly powerful. And then you combine that with somebody of Audra's talent and ginormous talent. And I think it's a thrilling performance, and I'm very excited. On the flip side, I do have a 26-piece orchestra, and actually we made a very conscious choice on this show to actually do a restoration of the original orchestration. And so much of this has not been heard in this form since 1959, since the original production, because subsequent revivals adapted it, and then it went on the road and that was adapted, and then with every various production, everybody's done their own thing. So what I wanted to do in this case, as opposed to She Loves Me, was to go back to the original source and say, okay, how was it done in 1959? we recreated that. I had a wonderful team from the Julie Stein estate who helped me do that work. And then I was able to have that as my sort of raw material, and then we were able to craft our production using those raw materials. So again, we did adapt certain things and we needed to adjust certain things based on what we were trying to do with this production. But I wanted to honor what was there first, because I think that's part of the job, is really, again, respecting what was created to then be able to make our own version of the show.
I'm so excited about the show. I've gotta go. I'm very excited.
Please come.
Yes. You also answered my second question, my next follow-up to that already, so I don't even need to ask it. So that's good. So your resume and breadth of work is unrivaled, right?
You're very sweet. Thank you.
Yes, it's very true. And you've answered this in some ways, but throughout your career, you've got to put your fingerprint, your baton on classics, right? Like She Loves Me, like Gypsy. What does that mean for you?
For me, it's really a childhood dream come true in a lot of ways. I fell in love with the old musicals as a child, and obviously I love a lot of new musicals as well, and I think part of the success of any great new musical is honoring the past and then pushing forward. And I think we see that oftentimes in shows like The Band's Visit. I mean, that was, for me, one of my more recent favorite new musicals, because it really took tradition and then pushed it forward. But for me, these old musicals are really, I don't believe in them as museum pieces. And I think part of the thing that I like, why I enjoy doing revivals, is to prove to people that they aren't museum pieces. I've had a lot of people come see Gypsy during our previews and say, I feel like I'm seeing it for the first time. And to me, that's actually the highest compliment that I could hear, because I think part of when revivals really started being done of musicals in the early 90s, I think there was a bit of skepticism about, oh, why are we starting to see a lot more of this? But I think as people have come to embrace that, I think it's a realization that A, these are really great shows, so they deserve to be continually performed. But I think what we've started doing incredibly well is bringing teams and assembling teams to look at them and to examine them and to make smart choices about how we present them to our audiences today. Because if we don't cultivate audience today, we won't have audience tomorrow. And I think just as you go to school and you study biology or you study math, I think part of going to revivals is actually to understand how we can then inspire young artists to want to create their own work so that we have work for tomorrow.
You've been on stages great, small. What for you is the power of regional theater? Why is that sphere of work so important?
In many ways, I consider it to be even more important than what we have in a 10-block radius here in New York, because theater was created at the outset as a form of social communication and a way to tell stories. We tell stories whether we're at home, whether we're at a restaurant, whether we're in a concert hall, whether we're on a stage. So in some capacity, we need to make sure that theater is alive and well everywhere. And we need to continue to manifest that, because without that, we can't have what happens here in New York, because it can't just be about 37 Broadway theaters or however many theaters. We have to have theater for everybody to go to. And we have to, it's the power of the arts. It's why arts needs funding. It's why we need to continue arts in theater, in schools. And one of the things that I love that regional theaters do more than anything is really look to that outreach for their community. How do we get the word out to schools? How do we get a word out to community groups and to get people to come in and experience new theater? And I think the power of Longworth, the power of Pasadena Playhouse, and these wonderful regional theaters around the country with vibrant communities and vibrant leaders, is that they are looking to source art to the community and to have a dialogue, because that's really what theater is. Theater is a communion of dialogue, and it's speaking to an audience, but also allow an audience to speak back to you. And everybody is giving their flowers back and forth to one another. And through that, and if we don't cultivate that, we will really feel the effects of losing that communion and that meeting with one another and how we can actually speak to one another. And I think that's why it's incredibly prescient that we have vibrant performing, not performing, but vibrant programming in regional, so that you can have a season like you all do, where it is a vast expanse. And I think that's essential for an audience, because if you get somebody coming to see She Loves Me and they fall in love with this, they're gonna go back to your website or to your socials and say, that surprised me. What are they doing next? And if we even get 5-10% of people doing that, that's how we generate audience. It's sort of my theory that, like, there's something for everyone in every piece of theater. And if we can tap into that well, then we continue to generate audience. And that's our big challenge, obviously, because there's rising costs, there's advertising, there's hooking people. Oh, what if the show doesn't have stars? Are people going to come? And I understand that there's the sort of business part of it, but there's also the heart and the emotional part of it that is far more important and far more relevant to why we need to be doing this, because this is what enriches us as people. This is what stimulates us to be able to have conversation with people and to feel whole, and to know that in a world that we are small in a large world. But these are the things that feed us and actually allow us to feel whole, to go to bed at night and know that tomorrow is okay.
You're almost done.
Oh, you're good.
You're good. Very quickly.
Yeah.
Can you give us Andy Einhorn's origin story? How did you get?
Oh gosh.
How did you get this love for musical theater, and what brought you to the place you are now?
I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I fell in love with music at a very early age. I have a few very distinct memories of taking theater classes and being on stage and being bit by that bug. But I also remember being in elementary school and watching the elementary school music teacher play the piano, and I was fascinated by how she was playing, but she was also using her feet with the pedals. And I remember coming home one day and telling my mother I wanted to take piano lessons, and she said, well, if you don't practice, we're gonna go to Hawaii and sell the piano, and that didn't happen, thankfully. But early on, I just fell in love with both sides of it. I actually performed a lot as a child professionally in Houston at the Alley Theater, Houston Grand Opera, Theater Under the Stars. So at a very early age, I fell in love with being on stage. As I got older, I started to want to do the creative side of it. And I really fell into music directing and conducting, because I realized early on as a child, when I would watch a musical, I was often watching the conductor. And I quickly learned that the conductor was the conduit between what was happening on stage and what was happening behind them with the audience. And there's a great symbiosis that happens right where I'm standing between allowing this energy behind me and the energy coming at me on stage and the energy coming up from the pit to synthesize. And my big challenge that I always say anytime I go to conduct a show is, how can I make sure that that energy starts out of the gate with a bang? And that's my biggest responsibility. And I just, because I believe that having a history as a performer I think that's informed my ability to be a better music director and a better conductor and an orchestrator because I was there. Obviously, in some ways, that feels like such a very distant chapter of my life, but it's always been a part of me because it makes me able to speak to actors and to be able to speak to my collaborators with the experience and the empathy of knowing what it takes to do that, because that is an incredibly vulnerable art. And that is hard to do. And I'm very aware of that. And so my job is always to support that and to be able to allow that to feel like it's a beautiful trust fall exercise every night between performer and musician and audience. And it's a trust. It's a bonding, and it's a entering into sort of almost a secret compact with one another to say, okay, we're gonna come together between the hours of 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. and what's happening tonight is just happening tonight. And that's what makes live theater special, is that no two shows will ever be the same. And that's okay, because some nights it might not be quite as good, some nights it might be electric, but somebody in that building is being moved and taken on a journey. And if we do that, we've done our job correctly.